The heavy grandfather clock in the hallway struck 2 o'clock, and the sound echoed through the large estate like a reminder of time passing too quickly. The Carter mansion, once filled with life and the booming laughter of William Carter, now felt like a museum of silence. Dust motes danced in the beams of sunlight that filtered through tall windows, and the air carried the faint scent of polished wood mixed with memories. One by one, the family members began to arrive. They came dressed in somber black suits and elegant dresses, as if the occasion were less about grief and more about appearances. Some of them wore genuine expressions of sadness, but most carried a certain anticipation in their eyes, the kind that comes when one expects fortune to change hands. The will reading was a formality, yes, but in this family it was also a competition. Margaret Ellis stood just outside the double doors to the study, clutching the strap of her worn handbag with nervous fingers. Her shoes were scuffed, her cardigan a little too thin for the drafty halls, and her skirt had been mended at the hem more than once. She looked out of place in the grandeur of the mansion, but she had spent nearly half her life here, tending to the house and the man who had called it home. When she finally stepped into the room, conversations faltered for a moment. Heads turned, eyes narrowed, and whispers started immediately. She had expected it, but the sting of their judgment still landed sharp. "Why is she even here?" a tall cousin muttered under his breath, though loud enough for others to hear. "She probably thinks he left her a trinket, maybe one of his old coats," another added with a chuckle. A ripple of laughter passed around the table. Margaret lowered her gaze to the floor, her cheeks warming, and made her way to a seat at the far end of the room. She chose a simple wooden chair against the wall instead of the padded leather seats around the table. It was safer there, away from their stares. The study itself was imposing. Dark oak paneling lined the walls, interrupted by tall shelves heavy with law books and old novels. A portrait of Mr. Carter in his younger years hung over the fireplace, his stern eyes watching the proceedings. The long mahogany table stretched across the room, polished to a shine, with folders neatly arranged at each seat by the lawyer's assistant. Margaret folded her hands tightly in her lap, trying to make herself small. She had worked in this house for almost 20 years, long enough to know the patterns of its people. She knew which relatives visited only during holidays, who sent birthday cards out of duty, and who never came at all until they smelled opportunity. Mr. Carter had often spoken to her about it when the house grew quiet. He wasn't blind to the fact that many of his family members cared more for his wealth than his well-being. But Margaret had never thought about inheritance. She was the housekeeper, the cook, the caretaker in his final years. She had been content with her role, content to serve, because Mr. Carter had treated her with kindness others often overlooked. As more family members trickled in, the whispers grew. A niece, her pearl necklace gleaming under the chandelier, leaned toward her sister and said, "It's embarrassing, really. She should have declined the invitation. This is family business." Her sister smirked. "Well, maybe she's hoping for a few dollars. People like her will grab at anything." Margaret's throat tightened, but she kept her expression calm. She had endured similar remarks for years, dismissive words, mocking glances, the subtle ways people made sure she remembered her place. She was used to being underestimated, to being invisible except when someone needed a room cleaned or a meal prepared. But sitting there, surrounded by polished shoes and gleaming jewelry, she felt the weight of every assumption pressing down on her. The lawyer, Mr. Grayson, entered the room then, bringing with him a quiet authority that hushed the chatter. He was an older gentleman with silver-rimmed glasses and a deliberate, unhurried manner. He carried a stack of documents, which he placed carefully on the table before adjusting his tie. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice steady, "thank you for coming today. We are here to honor the last wishes of Mr. William Carter. A man I had the privilege of knowing for many years. As you all are aware, Mr. Carter valued integrity, loyalty, and family. His will reflects those values. There was a murmur of agreement around the table, though Margaret noticed more than one relative exchange a sly glance, as if eager for their names to be read aloud. Mr. Grayson opened the folder and began to read. His tone was formal, almost detached, as he listed bequests one by one. Jewelry for nieces, paintings for nephews, a classic car for one of the grandsons. Each item mentioned sparked a buzz of satisfaction, or in some cases, mild disappointment. Margaret sat silently through it all, her gaze fixed on her lap. She hadn't expected to hear her name. She wasn't family. To the others, she was barely more than a shadow in the background of their lives. Yet, as the reading went on, she couldn't ignore the side glances thrown her way, the smirks and whispers. "Still sitting here," one aunt muttered under her breath. "She'll be lucky if he left her a thank-you note." A cousin stifled a laugh. "Maybe the old man left her the mop and bucket." The room erupted in quiet chuckles. Margaret's ears burned, but she didn't move. She kept her hands folded tightly, her knuckles white, her eyes on the polished floor. She remembered the long nights she had sat at Mr. Carter's bedside, reading aloud when he couldn't sleep. She remembered cooking his meals when his appetite had faded, listening to his stories about his youth, about mistakes and regrets, about dreams he had once carried. She remembered how his hand would sometimes tremble when he reached for hers, grateful for company when the house had grown too empty. The laughter in the room cut through those memories, sharp and cruel, but she held on to the truth she knew. Mr. Carter had valued her presence in ways these people never could understand. Mr. Grayson continued, his voice steady, unaffected by the undercurrent of mockery. "These are the specific bequests. Now we come to the final portion of the will, the distribution of the remainder of Mr. Carter's estate." The room fell into silence. The relatives leaned forward, eyes alight with expectation. This was the moment they had all been waiting for. Margaret's heart thudded in her chest. She wasn't sure why, perhaps because she sensed something no one else did. The way Mr. Carter had looked at her in his final days, the way he had pressed her hand and whispered words she hadn't quite understood. She sat very still, the weight of the room pressing down on her. Around her, people who had spent their lives looking down on her now prepared to celebrate their gains. And in that tense, waiting silence, Margaret realized just how much they had underestimated her, not because of anything she had done, but because they had never truly seen her. To them, she was invisible. To Mr. Carter, she had been something else entirely. Mr. Grayson adjusted his glasses and let the pages of the will fall neatly onto the polished table. The rustle of paper seemed louder than it should have been in the tense silence. Every person in the room leaned forward, waiting. Margaret remained at the edge of the room, her hands folded tightly in her lap, trying to still their trembling. He began with the smaller gifts. A set of antique cufflinks to one nephew, a jewelry box to a niece, a painting from the study to another cousin. With each name that was read, heads nodded and smiles flickered, though some looked disappointed if their prize was less than they had hoped. Margaret noticed how little the gifts were acknowledged with gratitude. No thank you, no softened expressions, just calculation. The lawyer's tone didn't change, but the weight of his words grew heavier as he turned to the final section. "And now we come to the remainder of Mr. Carter's estate, including the residence, financial holdings, and all remaining assets." The room seemed to inhale at once. A cousin sat up straighter, smoothing his tie. One aunt clutched her pearl necklace, as though already preparing to celebrate. Eyes darted toward each other, each person silently certain it would be them. But Mr. Grayson looked toward the far end of the room, where Margaret sat. His voice was calm, unwavering. Mr. William Carter leaves the entirety of his estate to Margaret Ellis. The words struck like a thunderclap. For a heartbeat there was silence, stunned, uncomprehending silence. Then came the eruption. "What?" one cousin shouted, half rising from his chair. "That must be a mistake," another barked. "She's not family." "She was the maid," a niece hissed, her face flushing red. The room buzzed with disbelief and outrage. Some stood, demanding to see the will themselves. Others turned on Margaret with looks of shock, anger, even betrayal. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. Her hands gripped the edge of her chair. She could feel every eye burning into her, could hear the venom in their voices. She shook, her head slowly, almost in disbelief herself. I don't understand," she whispered. But Mr. Grayson did not waver. He held up the signed document. "This is Mr. Carter's legally binding will. He was of sound mind when he wrote it, and he made his intentions clear. Miss Ellis is the sole heir." The chaos around the table only grew louder, but Margaret sat frozen. The mocking whispers from earlier replayed in her mind. The laughter, the dismissive words. A simple woman, invisible, not worth noticing. And yet, in the most important moment of his legacy, Mr. Carter had chosen her. She pressed her trembling hands together, her heart racing. She had never expected riches, never dreamed of inheritance. All she had ever wanted was to do right by the man who had shown her kindness. Now, his final act had given her more than she could comprehend and left everyone else speechless. The room dissolved into chaos. Voices overlapped, chairs scraped against the polished floor, and the heavy chandelier above seemed to tremble with the force of the arguments below. Some of the relatives accused Mr. Grayson of fraud, others muttered darkly about contesting the will, and a few simply stared at Margaret as if they couldn't reconcile the sight of her plain cardigan and scuffed shoes with the fact that she now owned everything they had expected for themselves. Margaret felt the storm circling around her, but couldn't move. Her heart pounded, her breath came shallow, and she sat rigid as though rooted to her wooden chair. The words echoed in her mind. The entirety of his estate to Margaret Ellis. They didn't feel real. Mr. Grayson raised his voice above the commotion. Mr. Carter's wishes were clear. He spoke often about loyalty and kindness, and he made his decision with a sound mind. There is no ambiguity. But the family wasn't listening. One of the cousins, red-faced, pointed a finger at Margaret. She manipulated him. That's the only explanation. She must have wormed her way into his good graces while the rest of us weren't looking. Margaret flinched at the accusation, but before she could speak, Mr. Grayson cut in firmly. "That is false. I personally met with Mr. Carter several times during the drafting of this will. He was deliberate. He told me in his own words that Margaret was the one who stood by him when no one else did. She cared for him, not for what he could give, but for who he was." The words silenced the room more effectively than a gavel. For a moment, even the angriest relatives had no reply. Margaret finally lifted her eyes, her voice trembling but steady enough to carry across the table. "I never asked for this. I never expected it. All I ever wanted was to make his days easier, especially at the end. Mr. Carter was kind to me in ways most of you never saw. If he left this to me, it wasn't because I tricked him. It was because he knew I loved him as a person, not a name or a fortune." Her quiet sincerity cut through the bitterness like a blade. Some of the relatives looked away, guilt flickering in their eyes, though pride kept their mouths shut. Others still seethed, unwilling to let go of their outrage. But in that moment, Margaret realized something powerful. She didn't need their approval. She didn't need their acceptance. For years, she had been overlooked, humiliated, treated as less than them. Now, not because of wealth, but because of truth, she was finally seen. She stood slowly, her legs trembling but her back straight. She looked around the room, meeting the eyes of those who had mocked her earlier. They shifted uncomfortably under her gaze. For the first time in her life, Margaret wasn't the invisible woman in the corner. She was the heir, the chosen one, and above all the reminder that kindness and loyalty held more value than pride and greed. And though the room was still buzzing with anger and disbelief, she walked out with quiet dignity, leaving behind the echo of her unexpected triumph.